as we get going, as we can see. First get started by letting you know what we're going to do today. And today we move out of, well, don't move out of primary sources because we're going to go a little bit into court rules today, but we move squarely into practice area. Practice materials. As I mentioned, some will be more primary sources like court rules, and then we'll move squarely into practice materials that are secondary sources. I like to cover the practice materials separately because honestly I think those are probably the materials that you're going to turn to most frequently now that you have a sense of what we're looking for and what the different areas are that are important in some of the issues. We will go through, as I said, court rules. Also, we will take a look at some other litigation type materials like jury verdicts and instructions and forms. And then with whatever time we have left, which may not be much, today we're back at a regular schedule, so we are done at 5:30. So whatever time we do have left, I do have a forms workshop. We'll actually start in print. And there's a reason for that, which I'll talk about when we talk about forms. And then if there's any time, you can then do the online portion. And whatever we don't get done today with the workshop, we will have plenty of time next class where we will have time to finish whatever we don't finish in the forms workshop today, and then go over administrative materials, and then there'll be time for assignment 5. Which, by the way, is already up on the website. I'll distribute the print copy next class since we're going to go over it more in depth. And I should mention with assignment 5, the way that the calendar has worked out, both combination of spring break and the end of the semester, and the fact that I try to schedule it so that you don't have to do much, if at all, of assignment 5 while you're on spring break. The point is to have a break. The assignment isn't due until Tuesday. Let me pull out it's due on Tuesday the 21st. Our last class is the following Tuesday the 28th. I need to get you back your graded assignment 5 because, as we'll go over next time, the last question is going to be a question that's very similar to what's on the exam, so I want to give you an opportunity on assignment 5 to do the question so that I can then give you feedback for that, and you can see that feedback, but of course, before you take the exam. So in order for me to have time to grade assignment 5, what we need to do, I can't give you the full extra week for those of you who might want to hand it in late. So it's due on the 21st. If you hand it in on the 21st, that's great. But if you can't hand it in on time, then I can only give you until that Friday, as opposed to the full week till the following Tuesday, because I can't have you hand it to me on Tuesday and get it back to you on the same Tuesday, obviously. So what I thought I would do, since I'm cutting short a little extra leeway time for those of you who might use it, we would spend some time on Thursday, at least starting on assignment 5. So that's my, hopefully, way of making it up a little bit. As I said, just because of how the calendar and snow days and everything worked out. Does that make sense? Okay. Sense is good. Alrighty. So as advertised, we move into the practice portion. Some of this will focus on litigation practice, but the forms portion is going to be basically just about any area of practice. And again, we'll talk more in detail in just a moment on that. So let's start with that litigation area, and let's start with court rules. And as I mentioned, these court rules are actually still technically primary authority. As we saw when we were talking about authority, they do have the force of law and you must follow them, but they, of course, cannot supersede statutes. So, in other words, if there's a statute and a court rule and they seem to conflict, it's the statute that's going to be the authority. Court rules are usually adopted and approved by judges. It's basically the judges saying how they want their courts to to operate, either individual judges, and we'll look at individual court judges' rules in a moment, or rules for entire court systems. So there's the unified court system for New York, and there are rules that apply to all of the courts in New York. Likewise, there are rules that apply to all of the federal district court, appellate courts. There are even rules for the U.S. Supreme Court. There tend to be two types of rules, and I'm sort of lumping them together, and I really shouldn't be. There are the court rules, as I mentioned, that are adopted typically by judges, and then there are the rules of civil procedure that you studied in depth, the federal rules of civil procedure in your first year, in Civ Pro, of course, and of course there's the CPLR in New York, and different states have their own versions of the CPLR. Sometimes adopted by the legislature, as is the case here in New York, sometimes adopted by judges or some committee of judges, as in the case of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. Federal Rules of Civil Procedure are actually, I have a handout, by the way, on rules, and I'm not going to go into nearly this detail, but this is for those of you who plan to be litigators or just are interested in court rules. So as you can see, the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, as well as procedure prepared by the Judicial Advisory Committee, approved by the Supreme Court. I wanted to read off of this so I didn't get it wrong. But the CPLR are, actually, as you can see, originally promulgated by the Judicial Conference, but then sections enacted by the legislature. So two sort of different branches of court rules. The sort of procedural that affects substantive rights. So the CPLR talks about statute of limitations, how long it is before you can no longer bring an action. And then the court rules, those adopted, approved by judges, tend to be more practice-oriented. You know, how many words on a page can you have? And as they go into a little more important aspects than that. And as you can see here in the handout, there are lots of different types of rules. Of course, civil procedure and criminal procedure, those more substantive rules in terms of what goes on when you bring actions in those various areas. But turning the page, of course, is evidence, also very important and substantive. Note here on the handout that New York actually has no formal codified law of evidence, which most people don't know. One of those little tidbits of potentially very useful information. Of course, on the federal end, there are the federal rules of evidence. Sentencing, another body of rules that obviously very much affect substantive aspects in the criminal realm. And then on page 3, a little more of the court rules, those judge developed rules that I just talked about. That apply to either entire court systems, levels of courts, or sometimes even just an individual judge's court. So you want to make sure you're aware of all of those should you be appearing, obviously, in the courts as well as before the judge. Okay. So one thing you want to think about, obviously, if you are a litigator or you do need to investigate, you want to be aware that you need to be aware of the court rules, and then to find them is a little tricky because they are usually categorized by the online system with statutes. So for instance, here on Westlaw, what you see is statutes and court rules, which is kind of interesting because at least here in New York, the statewide court rules actually appear in the administrative code, in our friend the NYCRR that we've been talking about. So even though they appear in Title 22, which is the judiciary title of the administrative code, you'll actually find those rules here. Westlaw, and you can see obviously the federal rules up here. Got statutes and court rules, and we see the long list of statutes, and then at the bottom, after all of the title of the statutes, we see McKinney's New York Court Rules, New York Federal Court Rules. And essentially, this is because how they used to appear in print. And I don't expect that you'll have much cause to go to the print these days, but just to give you a picture in case it helps you understand why you're looking online where you're looking online. This is one of those where it's just a legacy practice of the online vendors. But anyway, so what happened is these court rules, either in the old print days, which we still have a little bit of, the state court rules, for instance, got published in its separate pamphlet that lives at the end of McKinney's, our black McKinney's statute set. Or particular court acts. So the Family Court Act, which is what I pulled here, and there's several, there's I think a Surrogates Court Act. It's just how procedure before these courts evolved in New York. They wound up again in that judiciary title after the standard sections. So notice here we have General Obligations Law, Highway Law. We're just going alphabetically by title in McKinney's and the New York statutes. Indian Law, Insurance Law, Judiciary Law. There are sections within the Judiciary Law. Article 1, all sorts of things you have to know about judges and courts and clerks. And then if we go back, I'm going to come back here in a sec, you'll notice after Judiciary Law, not exactly in alphabetical order, Family Court Act, Court of Claims Act, Uniform Justice Court Act. So these specific court acts that are used in New York. And then after the Uniform City Court Act, we continue with the McKinney's titles alphabetically: labor, legislative, lien law, etc. And for whatever reason you're looking for that title, you need to know that anomaly looking through this list, because it's not listed alphabetically, nor is it where I would think it belongs, which is the administrative code, which is actually where you find the official citation. Official citation to these rules are actually 22 NYCRR, whatever their sections are. If you're interested, I'll pass these along. Again, more for the anomaly of old print publication than you're expecting that you'll really need to look in the print. And now interestingly, and I think actually makes more sense, in the other guys, the Hertz and Avis, Hertz is the number one and Avis is the other guys, right? So we've got McKinney's is what most attorneys use for New York statutes, and then CLS is kind of the other guys, now published by Lexis. The court acts, the court acts like the Family Court Act, as well as the court rules, are just at the end. So here I just pulled randomly off similar volume of the Family Court Act, and you would find court rules also in a volume just at the end of the set. And we'll go on to Lexis. Now Lexis, because you don't have that browse feature, well, you have the browse feature, but you don't have links right here on the front page. So you have to, as we now know, when you're looking for anything on Lexis Advance, go to Browse, go to Sources. You can try by jurisdiction. I actually had a little bit of York State. See, interesting. I had the, oh, wait, I just missed it. It's another thing. So New York State Federal and Court Rules. You have to know to type the word state, which, just between you and me, not my favorite feature. So this would be how you would get to that equivalent browse function if you wanted to look at a particular set of rules. Of course, on both systems, you can always do our favorite, just do a search. So I'm going to look for anything about e-filing. And yes, I could have limited my jurisdiction beforehand. Again, here is an example where you need to know that rules are going to be categorized under statutes, which is one advantage of searching them using the browse menu. And so let's just get to New York so we can see something a little familiar, since that's what we've been looking at. So I'm just applying my filter to New York. And so you notice here's a rule particular to the local rules of Queens County. So the nice thing about this is we search everything, so we don't have to figure out, is it a county court rule, is it a unified system rule, and we can limit a little bit by statute title, so we can go the CPLR, so again the statutory section, procedural section, or we can look at the local rules of court or state rules of court, depending our particular search pulled up from those particular titles. So obviously we can limit accordingly. So that would be the other way. Typically when you're before a court, well, I don't know what would make more sense. It depends on on what your situation is in the particular issue, but you can see both ways of approaching it, so now you have a sense. So likewise on Lexis Advance, which I'm just going to open up another tab. And I'll do, and just FYI, and my constant theme of computers aren't as smart as we are, when I was playing around with this search, e-file brings up different results than e-file without the hyphen. So computers don't know that that's really the same thing to us humans quite yet. And once again, we need to know to go to statutes and legislation. And this is just, we've done these narrowing down by filters many times at this stage. And notice Lexis actually gives us a nice separate heading for court rules. And so here's an example of the uniform rules for state trial courts, so not a particular area or county of New York, but it is a trial court. And it's where e-filing, our particular search, comes up. Questions? Moving on to Bloomberg. Actually, all I did here on Bloomberg to give you, actually that's the wrong tab. So here in the litigation, and you can see you can go to all state rules, or again we could narrow to New York. And this is a nice breakdown to give you a sense of what those rules are. So that would be the CPLR, and then obviously the different levels of court, the trial levels, and actually here are the ethics rules, which here in Bloomberg is tucked away with the court rules. On Westlaw, actually Westlaw is the easiest. You can bring up ethics rules just by typing the state, and then professional conduct typically will bring those up. And again, on Lexis Advance, you'd use the standard browse sources. Any questions on the basics of court rules? I know I haven't gone into much detail. More detail on the handout for those interested. Any details on how to navigate a little bit around those court rules online. As I said, I anticipate that's probably, you can of course find court rules for free at the various courts' websites, but the nice thing about going on the pay service is they bring them all together. So you can search them all at once if you need to. If you needed to know everything the courts say about e-filing, this is going to be a lot easier than trying to find the various different court websites. I should mention, however, having talked about the court websites, that's not where we want to go. I mentioned individual judges have their own rules. The best place I know to find them, I haven't found evidence of them on Lexis and Westlaw, but I will be, or Bloomberg, but I will be very honest with you, I haven't confirmed with those services that they are or are not available. So they may be there and I may not just have found them. But here, this is a free site, even though this is the New York Law Journal, which usually charges for everything. But if you just type in individual judge rules New York, and you'll find, and here you can see I broke down the New York trial courts, and it just lists the different judges that have their own rules. So anybody know a judge to take a look at? All right, then I'm going to choose somebody randomly. And these are going to be very specific. So you learn a little bit about Judge DeStefano. And here's Judge DeStefano's rules. And some of these will be telling you, looks like some of these let you know what how the judge plans on handling certain procedures and matters, and some of the things that you need to do when you submit. Oh, I'm sorry, question?
No, I know for a fact that Lexis does have judges' rules.
Oh, okay.
But it's under like weird numbering, so like you have to know that numbering in order to find it. So you're better off, I've found better off going onto the actual court's website and then going into the individual part and then judge and finding it that way. And it's also the most up to date that way. They change them constantly.
Oh, see, I did not know that. See, I'm not a litigator, as you've probably figured out at this point. But absolutely, and I should mention, at least from we've seen this site before as we've looked at the court structure, but this, I believe, is the site Helena is talking about, the New York courts.gov, and this is the courts portion of it as opposed to just the home. And you can definitely, we actually also, this is where you'd find some of the decisions when we were looking at sources for free decisions. And here under the courts, we see linked rules. So by all means. And actually here you can search rules. But just as we were saying, have a sense of what you are searching. I'm not sure if this search, all the rules also includes some of those individual. So joint appellate amendments, trial courts. So this is unified court and uniform rules of the trial courts.
So that's not an individual judge's rules?
Not here, it doesn't appear. But you're saying they're here.
They are on that website, yeah.
But, okay. So here, maybe you find them via the judges, judicial resources.
I usually go through the court and I'll find my particular court, and then that way they list the judges and I click on my judge.
That makes sense. Ah, well, good to know, thank you. Judges of the, anyway, actually go to the courts here and navigate as Helena suggests. Any questions? So here an example, it sounds like better off going here to the free website than trying to figure out where you find them on Lexis and Westlaw, especially if they are updated quite so frequently. One thing I can tell you, this applies more to the procedural rules, so to something like the CPLR, or of course the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, evidence, criminal, etc. And that is for understanding those procedures. I mean, you took an entire course on civil procedure that discussed many of the issues that come up. So for understanding those, there are a number of good treatises, both federal as well as New York State. And I can list you the names here. You may have heard of some of them: Federal Practice and Procedure, Wright and Miller, Siegel New York Practice. If you are a litigator in New York, you will get to know Siegel's New York Practice, as well as probably what's called Weinstein, Korn, and Miller. Those are actually the authors. The name of the treatise is New York Civil Practice, and it actually is on Lexis, but not on Westlaw. And Siegel's, on the other hand, is on Westlaw, but not under our contract. So you might have access to it on Westlaw out in the commercial world, but not here. But one thing I will go back, and we're going to start to see some of our themes come back as we go through these practice materials, and that is to remind you about research guides. And we took a look at this briefly back when we talked way back in the beginning of the semester when we talked about secondary sources. And basically I'm going to the library's homepage, I clicked on research, and here's a link to research guides, and what we have is a guide on recommended treatises. And if we take a look at civil procedure and practice, so remember research guides, they're going to be the place to give you links to those good treatises. And as we talk about these practice materials, many of those practice materials will also come under the category of treatises, and some we actually will have talked about. We're actually going to spend some time after spring break, a good portion of a class talking about loose leaves, which is just one type of treatise. But here you can see some practice treatises and the few that I mentioned, and those that you will get to know very well in New York if you are a New York litigator. Okay, so I did want to cover a little bit about court rules. Any questions or any additional information for those of you who've had more experience? Okay. Let's move on to forms. You will use forms wherever you wind up practicing, whether you are a transactional lawyer, a litigator, whether you are a negotiator, a mediator, you will use forms. Whether it's filling out court forms or whether you use forms developed by your particular institution. Basically, first of all, why reinvent the wheel? If someone has done this before and it's a standard, it's a separation agreement if you're in the family law area. It's a mergers and acquisition if you're in M&A, a purchase agreement if you're purchasing assets you're representing a business that's purchasing assets from another business, if you're securitizing. Not going to go on and on, which obviously I could. All of these, you draft some sort of agreement, you draft some sort of form. Obviously in the courts, there's a form of complaint. For those of you who are going to be litigators, there's a whole list of forms. Subpoenas, depositions, all of this stuff winds up, I won't say on paper anymore, but certainly in some form of document. These are not something that lawyers will sit down and just sort of start to invent. They will go to forms, whether those forms are in published form sets, which we'll be taking a look and actually we'll do a workshop on later, or the first place to look is your institution. There will be one of the attorneys who's been doing whatever you're doing for a little bit longer than you are, will have done it before and will have created a form, and they will have figured out, all right, it works very well this way, or it doesn't work so well this way. So what you want to remember, wherever you wind up, is to find out about, some call it a form bank. Now there's a fancier term because it involves more work product than just forms, and that's knowledge management. Have you heard about? I was mentioning to a couple of people who were here earlier, I was at a meeting of librarians, and it was a great meeting because some of us academics got together with some of the law firm librarians and talked a lot about what it is we in academia do to teach you how to do research, and then from the law firm perspective, when they all work with new attorneys or even attorneys who've been out a couple of years, what they feel like the attorneys are missing out on in their law school experience, and hopefully we as the academic librarians can help out with that. And one of those items, and I'll be talking about this meeting and referring to this pretty much for the rest of the semester because it really was very interesting and I think worthwhile. One of the items that came up is just to let you know about the fact that these knowledge management systems exist. These days they are online systems. They can be incredibly sophisticated, robust online systems to keep track of the firms or government or whatever organization we're talking about that you're working at, all of their work product, and they would hope that you, especially as new attorneys, would remember to check to see what the more experienced folks have done. So again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel or start from scratch. And because these are produced by the people, these documents are produced by the people in the firm, they know that they work for whatever it is your organization is trying to do, for the client, for the type of client that you have. So that's the first place you would want to look or ask about and find out about. One thing, unfortunately, I don't have access to is a knowledge management system to show you. Actually, Westlaw has one and markets it very intensively to firms, and I think it's mostly to firms, but maybe to businesses or corporate departments as well. But unfortunately, Westlaw doesn't make it available to us academics, so I can't show you. So if you ever see a Westlaw rep, go and yell at them. I want to see knowledge management. But that's just one example of many types of knowledge management systems. Some firms develop it in-house. Some firms hire programmers to develop for them, like I'm sure the big, large law firms that are worldwide firms. Some of them probably develop their own in-house. So there are all these different types of software and organizational systems out there, again, mostly online. These days, probably some even in the cloud. But they will have, again, the work product, and they will have sophisticated means of searching that work product. And again, depending on the system, Westlaw, homegrown, whatever. So I go on and on about this because it was pointed out, as I said in this meeting, by one of the librarians as something that a lot of new attorneys don't know about. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't know about it when I first started as an attorney way back when. So there you have it. Start there. Now, if you do not have a sample to go by that was generated in-house, there are lots of ways of finding forms on Lexis, on Westlaw. We'll look at Bloomberg another time, and I'll explain why. As well as print. I will be honest with you personally. You can Google. I have found that to be the least successful, although it's worth starting, as I'll actually show you an example that it works rather well. So let's dive in the other ways. I'll have you do the workshop. At least in print, there are form sets out there. So our friends American Jurisprudence has a whole set of legal forms. Our friend West has a whole set of legal forms, and it's just one page after another with different types of forms. And as you'll do the workshop, you'll get a sense of the range of forms that are available. You'll find great references to forms on, just as I was mentioning, research guides. So here is our recommended treatises research guide, but you scroll down, you'll see there's a New York Forms, just an entire research guide of different sets of New York forms. And we have major, like I mentioned, McKinney's has forms, but there are also specialized, practice area specific. So I'll just randomly choose. And so negligence, real property, trust and estates, real property for sure. There are going to be lots of different types of forms if you're representing a buyer or a seller of any kind of real property, or probably personal property. There are forms to be had and filled out. What I tend to find on Lexis and Westlaw, especially, well, really overall, it's best to have to find a set of forms. What I will sometimes do, because the trick with finding forms online is knowing the name of the form. Now, sometimes it's really obvious, but I'm going to show you an example where it's less of a couple of examples where it's less obvious. So I actually find sometimes going in the old-fashioned index, because as some of you noticed when you looked in print indexes, just sort of scanning a couple of columns, you realize what the terminology in it is supposed to be that you didn't think of on your own. And that tends to be the problem with finding forms, I find. So if you at least can start in a known set of forms, especially one that's specialized to whatever area you need to find the form in, area like real property, that will help you out. So let me give you an example of that. So let's go here to Lexis. And we'll go back, and rather than e-file, one thing you will want to do when a client walks through the door, as I've always said, always a good thing, is you will want to have an engagement letter so that your terms of your service are set forth and you and the new client are under the same understanding about what you'll do for that client. And that's sometimes known as an engagement letter. And what you'll notice on Lexis is it has a nice category for forms. But as I mentioned, the problem with forms is you have to know not only the right terminology, but even if you know the terminology, sometimes it gets incredibly too specific. So here's an example, an engagement letter with an accounting firm. If your client's not an accounting firm, or actually I think this is an engagement letter engaging an accounting firm. And scrolling down for financial advisory services. So these are engagement letters not for attorneys, but for other services. But what you'll notice, and typically I should mention with forms, well, sometimes you want to be jurisdiction specific, but it's also good to be flexible because sometimes some of the general sets like AmJur legal forms have perfectly good forms. So I'll typically start jurisdiction specific, and if I don't find one for my jurisdiction, then I'll say, okay, I'll settle for something in a general non-jurisdiction specific form book. So as we narrow to New York, so here we get, it looks like this at least is an engagement letter for legal representation, but it's very specific, joint spousal representation engagement letter. So if you're not in the family law area, this is, and talking about joint spousal representation, this form is useless. So it gets very specific for situations that unless you are lucky and it's your exact situation, not especially useful. One nice thing Lexis does is it gives you choice of different form types, and again, if your form type's in here, that's great. One other aspect, and as I mentioned, I find this to be the best strategy, is to take a look at the sources and see if any of them fit your particular area. So if this is just a general business client, these family law forms aren't going to do us any good. So what we see is forms for New York practice, so practice negligence, so perhaps a general business and commercial. And some of this might be a guess in terms of, and what we see here, and this is why I suggest that online searching for forms can be a little tricky, is what we see actually here is a retainer agreement. So it turns out it's sometimes called an engagement letter and sometimes called a retainer agreement. And again, Lexis didn't know that we meant, we got lucky that Lexis pulled this out because the word engagement and letter are in what Lexis calls a retainer agreement, or actually really what the New York Practice Guide Business and Commercial. Because the other aspect about forms, again, because it's so tricky to find, because they're so specific in terms of the circumstance that may not be yours, our technique of going to the source and then looking at the table of contents may be the best way to find the form that you're looking at. Because your first search may not work, but it might lead you to, so for instance, here's your Practice Guide Business and Commercial. We may want to start just at the very top of the table of contents, top of the hierarchy. Looks like the retainer agreement we were looking at comes under the form section having to do with securities offerings, but maybe we want to navigate to different parts of this set to see what else might apply. So again, that table of contents strategy with Lexis, as we saw, just going back real quick, what it pulls up, it calls Lexis forms, but it tells you where it came from, and again, that's the source that we actually chose. So again, what I find with searching for forms is going to finding the source that sounds promising or sounds the best or one of the best and checking it out, and then again looking at the table of contents. Actually, interestingly, letter of intent, that might be another way of phrasing this concept of what the agreement or letter or that you would give to an attorney would give to a client. Commitment letter. So again, because the terminology can vary, useful to use these other tools. Question?
Yeah. Can you do a form and then practice area search through Lexis, or is that just Westlaw?
You can definitely do it through Westlaw.
Because I just find when I search and then filter versus either publication or like practice area form search and then just scour through, like you said, the table of contents. I find it that way, but if I do it this way, I never find what I'm looking for. Yeah.
When you say this way, you mean?
Like searching and then filtering and then kind of going backwards or forwards depending, just like looking at my search results versus looking at a particular publication type or
So you like to do a pre-search filter is what you're saying?
yeah, I guess. But
Yeah, you could definitely go topics, which is essentially practice area.
yeah.
And so
But
if
usually it'll bring up like different forum publications, right? Or
Westlaw
or
does
Westlaw,
that.
Westlaw.
Let's actually, I haven't tried this, but it's worth, so let's go. So under sources, if we go by category and then go to forms, and so,
Yeah, I find this is better than
and then you have practice area.
right.
You can scan through, you can look through. Again, that's great if you can say, definitely I want banking law. But looking at these practice areas, if your client doesn't fit particularly well in any of these, then obviously it's going to not work as well. But yeah, that's a great, any way of using the tools that are there, whether it's pre-search filter, post-search filter, just remembering, again, as John was saying, you agree with me the table of contents is useful. So, you know.
More so here than other areas, because it's also, when you're doing a form, you're probably mixing, matching maybe various parts that you want. So you only get a sense of how narrow it gets or how specific it gets when you're looking at the table of contents. You never get that if you just like search.
Absolutely. I think we'll see a good example of that in Westlaw. Any questions on, we can come back to Lexis, but any questions? So on Westlaw, again here on the browse menu, you do have a category for forms, and this is one time on Westlaw where I would say it's definitely worth, if you know you need a form and you're going on Westlaw to look for a form, I would go to that form link because it brings up this form finder. Again, you don't have to be jurisdiction specific. You can look for forms just by topic and not be jurisdiction specific, or you can click on your jurisdiction and you still get that topical arrangement, and you also get some suggested publications. So if we take my suggestion just for a moment, we can try it the other way, and I know that I just want sort of general legal and business. I don't want any of these others specialized, and I do like going for looking at a particular title. And now we know it's a retainer, or we know that's one of the terms we might use. And So what we see here is that actually we're in the employment area. So maybe that's good, maybe that's not good, but it turns out that employment agreements for types of employment, it's actually an employment agreement for attorneys, which kind of is what we're talking about, even though you might not think about it in those terms. What we can see is general retainer by corporation, and as John was suggesting, gets pretty specific, and you don't realize that until you look at the hierarchy of the table of contents. So here's an attorney's hourly fee agreement, litigation. So very different than corporations. So you can see you have a nice selection, general counsel. You have a nice selection, special. One thing John mentioned too, when you are using forms, typically what you will wind up doing, and this is actually one argument for actually using the books, although I know I may have a tough sell on that, is that you probably won't use just one form. You're going to pick and choose from different forms. You'll still have to do some drafting on your own to make it specific to your client's particular situation, because it's rare that you're going to get the exact situation in a form. But you'll have sort of a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, column C, like in some restaurants, and you'll pick and choose the various clauses from each. And that becomes especially true the more complex the agreement that you're drafting or form that you're drafting gets. If you're drafting a very long complaint, you may want to take a lot from a lot of different sources, or a merger and acquisitions, or separate, whatever the agreement is. Again, we don't need to list them. And again, I find having the books open to those different possible clauses and flipping a little back and forth, rather than have to remembering, was that Lexis, was that Westlaw, which, or keep, like, as I have a tendency to do, keep a dozen or so tabs open and remember which tab is which, or which document on the bottom is which. So again, just a thought. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't, and online works for you, that's great also. Yeah.
But when you're doing that, when you're using the books, they'll ultimately, like, you find a section you like, you pull it up online, and then
You just took the words out of my mouth. Absolutely. My strategy is I might find the form in the index in print if I'm having difficulty, or using any of the strategies we just mentioned. If I want several forms, I might have them open, but to do the actual drafting, as you've seen, I'm a terrible typist. So I will see if I can find them online, and again, I'm being aware of costs for Lexis and Westlaw, making sure if forms are in my contract or not, but if they are and I don't have to worry about costs, I will see if I can find them online and download them, or copy and paste at the very least, so I don't have to type and correct all of my errors. The other thing you'll find about forms is that they are going to be very vendor specific. They're going to be form books that are published by West, which means that if they are online, they're only going to be on Westlaw. A lot of form books, a lot of the Bender treatises, a lot of the New York specific treatises some, especially litigation, are Bender treatises. Those are on Lexis only, because Lexis now publishes those quote-unquote Bender treatises. So you will not find a great deal of overlap in terms of form sets between Lexis and Westlaw. So there will be differences in coverage. All good points. Other points, questions? On Bloomberg, the forms you tend to find are transactional. And we're going to go over business and what you see here, dealmaker clauses and dealmaker documents. These are, again, transactional. When we talk more about business resources, we'll take a closer look at these. And that will be after spring break. And as I did mention, I don't find Google especially useful, but everybody likes to start with Google first, and there's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, in our case, New York Engagement Letter, as it turns out, one of the better sources, at least to start, or one of the forms that you'll look at to put together from columns A, B, and C, is actually the New York State Bar Association, which, as I did a Google search, New York Engagement Letter, turns out the New York Bar Association, and again, this is for free, gives you at least a start. So in this particular instance, a Google search was, I say it's hit or miss, so this is an example of hit, an example of, well, maybe you'll agree or disagree, but I think an example of miss if you were looking for a complaint. Because, of course, obviously the word complaint has a lot of different meanings, not just what we think of when you start a lawsuit. So actually here are complaint forms, but they're not complaints to a court. They're complaint forms for various New York agencies, how you file with that particular agency, which is great if that's the agency you want, but not great if you want a complaint to file to New York Supreme Court in Nassau County or wherever you are. And even if you get more specific in terms of the type of, you could say form, I'm not sure it's going to make any difference. You would spend, I think, a whole lot of time on Google, and I don't think you would get very much success. That's where I would go back to either Lexis or Westlaw and find a litigation-specific form set. Or if you find another strategy of narrowing by form and then by area of practice, all different strategies. So as I said, we will do a workshop in a little bit if we have time. Otherwise, we'll definitely have plenty of time next class. A couple of other types of practice materials before the workshop that I want to highlight. We've talked a little bit about jury instructions. Essentially, again, in litigation, complaints at the beginning of the process. At the end of a trial, each side, plaintiff and defendant side, will want to advocate a particular set of jury instructions to have the judge tell the jury this is what you're supposed to do. And obviously they would want that depending on what facts and specific parts of the law they would want to highlight. And there are form books for jury instructions. And as I think we talked about again way back, secondary sources is, we'll come back to that in a section. No, actually on Westlaw, the best way to go is just start jury instructions. And again, Westlaw will bring you to a page, it's federal. And the thing about jury instructions, which I didn't know until I sat listening to a panel of relatively new attorneys. I think they had graduated a year or two ago and talked about their experiences to the students at the room at the time. And what they said is, especially for the type of practice where they don't have huge deals or huge long drawn out litigation, but tend to be shorter, they actually do their research in New York pattern jury instructions. Because not only does it give you just what to suggest to the judge, but it actually gives you a sense of what the parameters of the area of law are. So, malpractice. So just by way of example, so this has to do, obviously you can see negligence actions, and so it spells out for you what to establish liability for malpractice must prove the preponderance of the evidence. So you're getting actually a little bit of what this particular area of the law, and of course the other thing you get are comments and references to cases. Now this isn't in-depth, this isn't exhaustive by any means, but it is the classic quick and dirty, or at least a start, even if you don't stop here, which you may or may not want or need to do. Sometimes the jury instructions will set out elements of a cause of action. So you'll get the three, what you need to show as part within the jury instructions. So useful to know about, again, if you're in litigation, but also useful, worth checking out, even if you're not just as a secondary source. And actually New York pattern jury instructions will come up in the secondary sources on Westlaw. New York pattern jury instructions will not come up on Lexis because it's published by West. But you will find jury instructions on Lexis. And the best way I can show you is one of our favorite searches, and basically our standard search. And Lexis actually just gives us a link. And as far as I can tell, again, I haven't looked exhaustively, this is basically actual litigation examples from real cases. So, well, this is actually a secondary source. So it's a little bit of both. And on Bloomberg, not a huge amount in terms of jury instructions. Basically, I went to all legal content and drilled down by jurisdiction to New York. And under jury instructions, all we have are the criminal jury instructions. And where you will find, we were looking at pattern jury instructions, which are civil. Criminal jury instructions in New York are actually online. See if I have them. Here we go. Again, in that newyorkcourts.gov that we were looking at for court rules, you'll also find the criminal and jury instructions. And again, honestly, the easiest way to find this, well, you could navigate through the court website, or you could Google New York criminal jury instructions. And this will come up fairly easily. And this is pretty much where you'll find this. You will probably find reference to this or some form of this on Lexis and Westlaw, but I kind of wonder why you would want to do that when it's available for free, although it is searchable, so that may be one reason too. Last but not least, in terms of practice materials, and again, we're still in the litigation realm for the moment, and that is jury verdicts. You get past the jury instructions. You want to suggest to the jury, if you're suing for damages, how much, and there's even a place to read about that. It's actually kind of interesting in a way. So again, if Westlaw would go back, you'll see a link here, and here you do want to be specific. You could search first and then narrow by post-search filters later on. But typically, if you are looking for sample verdicts or sample amounts, so it gives you the can go this way again, or as I said, actually, let's go. And the reason I like to go this way is because you get the filters to narrow. You can narrow by amount. So for legal malpractice, you could see examples of cases, maybe 2 million, and probably, again, you want to narrow by jurisdiction. And just so you can see what there used to be print jury verdict reporters, so cases that had verdicts on different areas of liability for different amounts. And so you can see the summary and witnesses, and obviously the amount we narrowed was somewhere in the $2 million range. And here on Lexis, and pretty much Lexis and Westlaw are the only area services where I know where these are available. As I said, they used to be available in print, but they are no longer. Here on Lexis, we've been in the Lexis Advanced Research portion for pretty much the entire course thus far, but there is a verdict and settlement analyzer. And this is kind of cool. Oh, I forgot to put, see, as you can see, we got too many results because I forgot to put quotes. So you get graphs. Again, we can narrow by all sorts of our typical cases per year, award amount. So you can get some interesting information. So again, if you want to have a sense of what gets awarded and what you want to ask for, these reporters actually do exist. Any question about jury instructions, jury verdicts? Okay, we don't have a huge amount of time. So, oh, I have it over here. So I think given that we only have a quarter of an hour, rather than head upstairs, because by the time we get up it'll be just about time to turn around, why don't we start on the and now I have divided up into 5 different groups. You're welcome to work together with your, so 2 people have the same assignment. So you're welcome to work together with your other group member, so groups 1 through 5, group 1 work with group 1 obviously, or if you just want to dive off on your own, that's fine too. You will eventually have to share books next time, but I'm sure you'll work that out. So I have. So let's start online. I ask you to choose 2. There's my copy. So online is going to be actually question 2 of your group. So choose any of the 2 of the 4 resources, Google, Bloomberg, Lexis, Westlaw. You only need to choose 2. And then the information, you may not find all of the information I list in terms of name of form, form number, chapter, subchapter, citation, section number. But whatever information you find, just indicate that. And if you need more room on the other side, although it shouldn't be that much text, you can write on the back of the sheet. And of course, let me know if you have questions. And I do have everybody's assignment 3, so if I didn't give it to you before class, check with me before you leave.
Figure out that now, is it?
Yeah.
Sorry for being late, by the way. Totally lost track of time. I was on the other side of the basement. I just zoned out for 7 hours down there.
It happens.
Thank you.
Question? Again, you may or may not have that information. So there's the section number. So there's the name of the resource, there's the section number.
So that's all, if it was there, it would be somewhere here, I guess, if they did have it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
State planning and health. But that should have
Some
still-
like
still
people
count.
want,
Oh, you're on
if
the.
you're
Yeah, I'm on
looking
this.
at have a living on a healthcare policy, because they're two separate things. However,
I
the
know what you're
form
saying.
resource, some will find they do together,
Right,
they're obviously related, and some will have them separately.
right. So
As
either
long
one?
as you, yeah, either
Okay.
one. As long as you have one of each
Yeah,
in some organizational format, that's fine.
okay.
I guess that would be two. Big chemicals, if we can incorporate one to them.
Yeah, so this is.
Yes, so
Plus that.
we're looking at material.